A gathering at the Carter family farm. When family ties unravel and a legacy hangs by a thread, one woman must rise against betrayal, greed, and doubt to protect the dream her father built. Will she succeed, or will the past be lost forever? Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The late afternoon sun hung low over the vast Carter family farm, casting a golden glow over the weathered wooden fences and sprawling fields of sunflowers that swayed gently in the humid breeze. This place, nestled just outside Savannah, Georgia, had been the heart of the Carter family for over 3 generations, a legacy built on sweat, soil, and resilience. Yet today, it felt as though the air carried more weight than the summer heat. Inside the main house, a group of relatives gathered in the parlor, their voices low but laced with a tension that threatened to boil over. The occasion for the assembly was somber. Henry Carter, the patriarch of the family, had passed suddenly from a heart attack only a week ago. His death left not only an emotional void, but also a growing uncertainty about the future of the family farm. Grace Carter, the youngest of Henry's 3 children, stepped into the room, feeling the familiar creak of the floorboards beneath her feet. After years away in Chicago pursuing a career as a botanist, the house seemed both foreign and achingly familiar. The scent of aged wood and faint traces of her father's favorite pipe tobacco still lingered in the air. It was a bittersweet homecoming, made even harder by the undercurrent of discord among her family. Thomas Carter, her eldest brother, sat at the center of the room, his presence commanding attention as always. At 42, he exuded the self-assured demeanor of a man used to being in charge. His tailored blazer and neatly trimmed beard contrasted sharply with the rustic surroundings, a symbol of the divide between him and the family's farming roots. "We all know this place is a financial burden," Thomas was saying, his tone clipped. "Dad may have loved it, but let's not romanticize the past. The farm's value is in its land, not its memories. Selling it would give us the resources we need to move forward." Grace's jaw tightened. She stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Move forward to what exactly? Turning the farm into some corporate development? This land isn't just property, Thomas. It's part of who we are. It's part of who Dad was." Thomas's eyes narrowed as he turned to her. "Grace, you've been gone for years. You don't understand the reality of running this place. It's not sustainable. And frankly, we need the money more than we need a sentimental relic." Before Grace could respond, their middle sibling, Emily, spoke up from her seat by the window. "I think Thomas has a point," she said hesitantly, avoiding Grace's gaze. "We all love Dad, but maybe it's time to be practical. Think about what we could all do with our share." Grace felt a pang of betrayal at Emily's words. She looked around the room, searching for even a single ally among the gathered family members. But all she saw were calculating expressions and murmurs of agreement, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. How had they all turned so cold so quickly? "Enough!" a new voice cut in. Mr. Wallace, the family's longtime attorney, stood in the doorway, holding a leather-bound folder in his hands. His stern expression silenced the room. "The will shall be read this Saturday at noon. Until then, I suggest you keep your speculations to yourselves." The room fell silent. Grace watched Thomas exchange a glance with Emily, their shared smirk a reminder of how outnumbered she felt. As the group began to disperse, their whispered conversations about potential buyers and financial opportunities trailing behind them, Grace slipped out of the room. She climbed the creaky stairs to her old bedroom, seeking solace in the one place that still felt untouched by the chaos brewing downstairs. The small room was exactly as she'd left it. Soft yellow walls, a quilt her grandmother had made folded neatly on the bed, and her father's favorite gardening books lined up on the shelf. She sat on the edge of the bed, letting out a long breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Her gaze fell on the old oak dresser across the room, where a small envelope rested conspicuously atop a stack of books. Her heart skipped as she recognized her father's handwriting on the front. "Grace," it read, in his familiar bold script. With trembling hands, she picked up the envelope and slid out the folded paper inside. The words on the page were brief, but filled with an urgency that sent a chill down her spine. "My dearest Grace, if you're reading this, then I'm no longer there to guide you. But you must know, things are not as they seem. Protect the farm at all costs. It's more important than you realize. Trust yourself and remember, what's right isn't always easy. Love, Dad." The room seemed to close in around her as the weight of his words sank in. Protect the farm at all costs? What had he meant by that? And why had he chosen to write to her specifically? Questions swirled in her mind, but one thing was clear. Her father had trusted her with a responsibility far greater than she had anticipated. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields outside her window, Grace resolved to honor her father's wishes. No matter what it took, she would fight for the farm and for the legacy he had worked so hard to build. The morning air inside the old Carter estate felt heavy with tension. The large dining room table, usually reserved for holiday feasts, was now the stage for a makeshift family meeting. Thomas stood at the head of the table, a commanding presence in his tailored suit, his voice calm yet persuasive. Around him sat a few family members, including Aunt Lorraine, Uncle Richard, and their cousin Megan, each with varying degrees of interest and apprehension as Thomas laid out his plan. "We're sitting on a gold mine," Thomas began, gesturing grandly at the room as if the walls themselves represented untapped wealth. "The land is worth more now than ever before. Developers are chomping at the bit to turn it into something lucrative. We're talking millions, enough for each of us to secure our futures. It's what Dad would have wanted, for us to prosper." Grace, seated at the far end of the table, clenched her fists under the tablecloth. She had stayed silent so far, letting Thomas spin his story. But as he spoke, she felt the slow, burning anger rise within her. He was using their father's name to manipulate them, twisting his memory into a justification for greed. "And what about the farm itself?" Grace finally interjected, her voice steady but sharp enough to cut through Thomas's rhetoric. "What about the history here? The values Dad spent his whole life instilling in us? He wanted this place preserved, not bulldozed for profit." Thomas turned to her, his smile cold and condescending. "Grace, let's be realistic for a moment. The world doesn't run on sentimental memories. This property is a financial asset, one we can't afford to cling to out of nostalgia." "Nostalgia?" Grace shot back, her tone rising. "This isn't about nostalgia, it's about honoring his legacy, keeping this land as something future generations can appreciate. You're asking us to trade all of that for a quick paycheck?" Thomas sighed heavily, the weight of his impatience clear in his expression. "And there it is, the idealist speaks," he said mockingly, drawing a few chuckles from the others. "Grace, you've been gone for years. You left Dad to handle everything on his own while you were out chasing your dreams in Chicago. You have no idea what it was like for him to hold this place together." The words hit Grace like a blow. She opened her mouth to defend herself, but Thomas didn't give her the chance. "And let me tell you something else," he continued, leaning forward with a calculated pause. "Do you know why part of the property is already mortgaged? Because Dad had to bail me out when my company hit a rough patch. That's right, our father put this land at risk because you weren't here to help. So don't sit there and preach to us about loyalty or legacy." The room fell silent, Thomas's revelation hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Grace felt a knot tightening in her chest as the family's eyes turned to her, some with pity, others with suspicion. Aunt Lorraine shook her head disapprovingly, and Uncle Richard muttered something about misplaced priorities. "So what do you have to say now?" Thomas pressed, his voice tinged with triumph. Grace swallowed hard, fighting to keep her composure. "What I have to say," she began, her voice trembling but resolute, "is that you've taken everything Dad stood for and twisted it into an excuse for your mistakes. This isn't about me, and it certainly isn't about honoring him. This is about you trying to cover your tracks." Thomas smirked, leaning back in his chair as if her words had no effect. "Believe whatever helps you sleep at night, Grace, but the fact is, we need to make a decision soon. Either you're with us or you're against us." The meeting adjourned soon after, leaving Grace feeling more isolated than ever. As the others left the room in groups, whispering among themselves, she lingered behind, staring at the empty chair where her father had always sat. She could almost hear his voice, calm and steady, urging her to keep fighting for what was right. Later that evening, as the house grew quiet, Grace found herself in her father's study. The room smelled faintly of tobacco and old books, a comforting but bittersweet reminder of his presence. She rummaged through his desk drawers, her fingers trembling as she searched for answers to the questions swirling in her mind. Then she saw it, a folded piece of paper tucked beneath a stack of old receipts. Pulling it out, she unfolded the document and scanned its contents. Her breath caught as she recognized the letterhead of a local bank. The document was a loan agreement, with her father listed as the guarantor. But what struck her most was the name of the borrower, Thomas Carter. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. Thomas hadn't just relied on their father's generosity. He had taken advantage of it, borrowing large sums of money under the pretense of saving his business. And now he was trying to sell the family's legacy to cover his own debts. Grace sat back in the chair, clutching the document tightly. She knew this was just the beginning, that there was more to uncover. But one thing was clear. She wasn't going to let Thomas destroy everything their father had built. Not without a fight. The late afternoon sunlight filtered through the tall oak trees lining the driveway to Eleanor Jacobs' home, a modest brick house nestled on the outskirts of Savannah. Grace parked her car and took a deep breath before stepping out. Her chest felt tight with the weight of her decisions and the mounting opposition she faced. Eleanor had been her father's confidant for decades. If anyone could guide her, it would be her. Eleanor greeted her at the door, her sharp green eyes scrutinizing Grace with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Come on in, Grace," she said warmly, stepping aside to let her in. "I had a feeling you'd show up sooner or later." The interior of Eleanor's house was as orderly and practical as the woman herself. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with legal texts and framed photographs of her travels. Grace settled into the armchair Eleanor indicated, her fingers nervously twisting the strap of her bag. "I'm guessing you've heard about Thomas," Grace began, her voice quieter than she intended. Eleanor raised an eyebrow as she poured 2 cups of tea. "I've heard enough. The family meetings, the arguments. It's no secret that Thomas has been making his move." She handed Grace a steaming cup before settling across from her. "But I need to hear it from you. What are you fighting for, Grace? Why does keeping the farm mean so much to you?" Grace hesitated. The question, though simple, forced her to confront her own doubts. "It's not just about the farm," she said finally, her voice gaining strength. "It's about honoring my father's legacy. He poured his life into that land, not for the money, but because he believed in its purpose. It's part of who he was, part of who I am." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully, her fingers tapping lightly on the edge of her mug. "That's a good start. But Grace, you need to understand something. This isn't going to be easy. Thomas isn't just looking to sell the land. He's building a coalition, and most of the family is already leaning his way." The words hit Grace like a cold slap. She knew Thomas had influence, but hearing it laid out so plainly made the challenge feel insurmountable. "So, what do I do?" Grace asked, her voice laced with frustration. Eleanor leaned forward, her expression turning serious. "First, you fight with facts. Find the proof of your father's intentions, anything that ties his wishes to preserving the farm. Second, you need to act fast. The longer you wait, the more ground Thomas gains." As Eleanor spoke, an idea seemed to crystallize in her mind. She stood abruptly and gestured for Grace to follow her to the study. Papers and folders were neatly stacked across the desk, but Eleanor knew exactly where to look. She pulled out a thick folder labeled Henry Carter, Private Documents. Together, they pored over the contents. Grace's heart raced as she uncovered old contracts, handwritten notes, and financial records. But it was a faded envelope, tucked away at the bottom of the pile, that caught her attention. "What's this?" Grace asked, holding it up. Eleanor took the envelope and carefully opened it, revealing a signed agreement and a handwritten letter from her father. The agreement was a pledge to donate part of the farm's annual profits to an environmental nonprofit focused on land conservation. The letter, in her father's distinct scrawl, explained his dream of transforming the farm into a nature reserve. "This is it," Grace whispered, her fingers tracing the lines of her father's words. "He never wanted the farm to be sold. He wanted it to be something bigger, something that could last for generations." Eleanor nodded, her expression resolute. "This is important, Grace. It's not just a financial trail. It's evidence of your father's intentions, but it won't be enough on its own. You need to get the family on your side, or at least enough of them to block Thomas's plans. If they sign a binding agreement not to sell before the will is read, it'll give us the leverage we need." Grace felt a surge of hope tempered by a pang of anxiety. Convincing her family, who already viewed her as an outsider, would be no small task. "Do you really think I can do that?" she asked. Eleanor's gaze softened. "I think you owe it to yourself and to your father to try. He believed in you, Grace. Maybe it's time you started believing in yourself too." The weight of Eleanor's words settled over Grace like a challenge she couldn't ignore. She didn't have all the answers yet, but for the first time she felt a flicker of confidence. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room, Grace gathered the documents and prepared to leave. Before she stepped out, Eleanor placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "You're stronger than you think, Grace," Eleanor said quietly, "and you're not alone in this." Grace nodded, clutching the folder tightly to her chest. The path ahead was daunting, but now she had a clearer direction and the first solid proof of her father's wishes. She would need every ounce of strength, every shred of courage to face the battles ahead. Grace adjusted the stack of papers in her hands, her heart racing as she glanced out the window of the family's dining room. The sprawling fields of the Carter family farm stretched out before her, their golden hues glimmering in the afternoon sun. She drew a deep breath and turned back to the gathered family members sitting around the long wooden table. This was her chance, perhaps her only chance, to convince them to honor their father's wishes. "I asked everyone to meet today because there's something you all need to see," Grace began, her voice steady though her palms felt clammy. She placed the documents on the table, carefully spreading them out for everyone to see. "These are letters, notes, and plans that Dad left behind. They prove he wanted this farm to be turned into a conservation site, a legacy for future generations." The room was silent for a moment, the air heavy with tension. Grace's Aunt Janice leaned forward, squinting at the papers, while her cousin Emma exchanged a wary glance with Thomas, who sat at the head of the table like a king presiding over his court. Thomas didn't even bother looking at the documents. Instead, he crossed his arms and smirked. "Grace," Thomas said, his tone condescending. "This again? Do you really expect us to believe Dad wanted to give up everything for what? Some trees and birds? This isn't just about the environment," Grace shot back, her voice rising. "It's about preserving his life's work. He spent decades pouring his heart into this farm, and he wanted it to mean something beyond just money." Thomas's smirk faded, replaced by a scowl. He leaned forward, his voice cutting like a knife. "Or maybe you're the one who wants this to mean something, Grace. Let's not forget, you left. You walked away from this family, from this farm, from everything Dad built, and now you're trying to waltz back in and tell us what to do." Grace flinched at the accusation, but she refused to back down. "I left because I needed to find my own path. That doesn't mean I stopped caring about this place or about Dad's vision." "Vision?" Thomas barked a laugh. "Let me show you the reality of Dad's vision." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder, slamming it onto the table. "Here's what he didn't tell you, Grace. The farm has a massive debt, one he took on to keep this place afloat. And guess what? That debt hasn't magically disappeared." The family gasped as Thomas opened the folder, revealing bank statements and loan agreements. He pointed to the figures, his voice rising with triumph. "Dad borrowed hundreds of thousands of dollars. This farm is a sinking ship, and the only way to save ourselves is to sell. You might be fine living in your little dream world, but the rest of us can't afford to." Grace's heart sank as she stared at the documents. The numbers blurred before her eyes and a wave of doubt crashed over her. She thought she had been prepared for Thomas's resistance, but this was a blow she hadn't seen coming. The room erupted into murmurs as the other family members leaned closer to the papers. "Is this true?" Aunt Janice whispered, her voice shaky. "Did Henry really borrow that much?" Grace tried to regain her footing. "Even if there's debt, it doesn't mean we have to sell. There are other ways to—" "Enough!" Thomas snapped, slamming his hand on the table. "You're not the one who's been here, Grace. You don't get to make decisions for the rest of us. And honestly, why should we trust you? You've always had your head in the clouds, chasing some idealistic nonsense while the rest of us dealt with the real world." The words hit Grace like a slap. She looked around the table, searching for a glimmer of support, but the faces staring back at her were filled with doubt and hesitation. Even those who had seemed to side with her earlier now avoided her gaze, their silence speaking volumes. "I can't believe this," Grace whispered, her voice barely audible. "You're all willing to throw away everything Dad stood for, just for money?" "It's not just about money," Thomas retorted. "It's about survival." Grace's hands trembled as she gathered the papers, her vision blurred by unshed tears. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the room, the heavy silence behind her broken only by the faint hum of whispered conversations. She stepped outside, the warm breeze doing little to soothe the sting of betrayal. As she crossed the porch, she pulled out her phone, desperate for some kind of anchor in the chaos. A familiar name lit up the screen: Eleanor. "Grace," Eleanor's voice came through, calm yet urgent. "I just got a call from someone who says they have information about your father's finances. It might be the break we've been looking for. Grace clutched the phone tighter, her heart pounding with a mix of hope and fear. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll explain everything," Eleanor replied. "But first you need to come to my office. We don't have much time." Grace looked back at the house, the muffled voices of her family still drifting through the open window. She turned away and headed for her car, determination replacing the despair in her chest. Whatever Eleanor had to say, it was her last hope. The cafe Eleanor had chosen for the meeting was tucked away in a quiet corner of downtown Savannah. The atmosphere inside was warm and inviting, with the faint scent of coffee and baked goods wafting through the air. But Grace couldn't focus on the cozy surroundings. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her cup of chamomile tea, her thoughts spinning in anticipation of the man they were about to meet. Robert Hales arrived precisely at the scheduled time, his demeanor calm, yet purposeful. He was a man in his late 50s with neatly combed gray hair and a leather briefcase that hinted at the seriousness of his visit. After a polite greeting, he took a seat across from Grace and Eleanor, his expression unreadable. "I won't waste your time," Robert began, placing his briefcase on the table. "I'm here because I believe the truth needs to come to light." Grace's heart raced as she leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "What truth?" Robert opened his briefcase, pulling out a folder filled with neatly organized documents. He slid it across the table to Grace and Eleanor, his gaze steady. "This is a copy of the loan agreement for the mortgage on your family's property. Contrary to what Thomas has told you and your family, it wasn't your father who initiated this loan. It was Thomas." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Grace felt a chill run down her spine as Eleanor, always composed, began to carefully examine the documents. The older woman's brow furrowed as she flipped through the pages, her lips pressing into a thin line. This has Thomas's signature," Eleanor murmured, holding up one of the documents for Grace to see. "He used the property as collateral for a business venture, a failing business venture, according to these records." Grace's stomach turned. "So my father, he didn't take out that loan to save the farm? Thomas lied to everyone?" Robert nodded solemnly. "It seems he did. Your father likely agreed to let Thomas handle the loan paperwork, trusting him to do what was best for the family. But when the business failed, Thomas used your father's name to shield himself from scrutiny." Grace's hands gripped the edge of the table as she stared at the damning evidence before her. Her mind raced with memories of her brother's confident declarations, his dismissive attitude, his insistence that selling the farm was the only viable option. Every piece of it now felt like a carefully crafted manipulation. Eleanor's voice broke through Grace's thoughts. "This is exactly what we need to confront Thomas at the D. Chuck reading. With this evidence, you can prove his deceit and protect your father's wishes." Grace hesitated, the weight of the decision settling heavily on her shoulders. "But if I do that, it'll destroy what little is left of our family. I can't humiliate Thomas in front of everyone. He's still my brother." Eleanor softened, her tone steady but understanding. "Grace, I know this isn't easy, but sometimes protecting the truth means making sacrifices. Your father entrusted you with this responsibility. The farm, his legacy, it depends on you now." Grace pressed her hands to her temples, trying to quiet the storm of emotions raging inside her. "I don't want to be the one to tear my family apart, but I can't just stand by and let Thomas get away with this." Robert interjected gently. "Miss Carter, I understand your hesitation, but if you don't act now, Thomas will sell the property, and your father's vision for the farm will be lost forever. Sometimes doing the right thing feels wrong in the moment, but history has a way of proving it was worth it." The words struck a chord, but they didn't make Grace's decision any easier. She thanked Robert for coming, and as he left, she promised herself she would consider every option carefully. The weight of the folder in her bag felt unbearable as she and Eleanor walked back to the car in silence. That night, Grace sat on the edge of her bed in the dimly lit room she'd grown up in. The familiar creak of the wooden floors and the soft hum of cicadas outside should have brought her comfort, but instead, they reminded her of the enormous responsibility she carried. The documents from Robert sat on her nightstand, their presence a constant reminder of the choice she would have to make. She picked up her father's photograph from the bedside table, tracing the lines of his kind smile with her fingertips. "What would you do, Dad?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Would you want me to expose Thomas, even if it meant breaking our family apart. The silence of the room offered no answer, but Grace felt the tears begin to well in her eyes. She placed the photograph back on the table and lay down, staring at the ceiling as her mind replayed every conversation, every argument, every memory of her father's unwavering belief in her. By the time dawn broke, she still hadn't found the clarity she desperately sought. All she knew was that the upcoming reading of the will would force her to decide, and whatever choice she made, it would change everything. The evening air around the Carter family's ancestral home was thick with tension. Grace sat by the window in her childhood bedroom, her mind racing as she considered her next steps. The folder containing the damning documents about Thomas lay on the desk beside her, its contents threatening to fracture what little remained of her family's unity. She knew the decision she faced would forever alter their lives, but the question was whether she had the courage to follow through. A soft knock at the door broke her concentration. Grace turned to see Aunt Margaret standing hesitantly in the doorway. Margaret, the oldest sibling of Henry Carter, had always been the quiet observer, rarely taking sides in family disputes. Tonight, however, there was a newfound determination in her eyes. "Grace, may I come in?" Margaret asked, her voice unusually soft. Grace nodded, gesturing toward the small armchair by the window. "Of course, what's on your mind?" Margaret sat down, her hands nervously clutching the folds of her cardigan. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened at the meeting earlier," she began, "and I realized I can't stay silent anymore. It's not right." Grace raised her eyebrows in surprise. Margaret had always been known for her neutrality, often staying out of heated discussions and conflicts. "I appreciate that, Aunt Margaret, but what made you change your mind?" Margaret hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. "Your father," she said quietly. "Years ago, when my husband's business was failing, we were on the verge of losing everything. Henry stepped in and gave us a loan to keep us afloat. He never once asked for anything in return. He only wanted to make sure we were okay. And now, seeing how Thomas is twisting the truth about his legacy, I just can't stand by and let it happen." Grace felt a lump form in her throat. "Why didn't you say anything before?" Margaret shook her head. "Because I was afraid of Thomas, afraid of disrupting the family. But I can't let that fear control me anymore. Your father believed in doing the right thing, no matter the cost. It's time I honored that." Grace's shoulders relaxed for the first time in hours. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "I can't do this alone." Margaret leaned forward, placing a reassuring hand on Grace's knee. "You're not alone, Grace. I'll stand by you at the reading tomorrow, and I'll speak to a few others who might be willing to support you." The weight of isolation lifted slightly from Grace's chest. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope that she might not have to fight this battle entirely on her own. Later that night, Grace returned to the living room to review her father's files once more. As she sat by the fire, lost in thought, a shadow fell across the room. She looked up to see Thomas standing in the doorway, his expression dark and unyielding. "We need to talk," he said flatly, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. Grace set the file down carefully, bracing herself. "What do you want, Thomas?" He crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing as they landed on the folder beside her. "I know what you're planning, Grace. You think you can humiliate me in front of everyone tomorrow? Think again." "I'm not trying to humiliate anyone," she shot back. "I'm trying to honor Dad's wishes and protect what he cared about most." Thomas let out a bitter laugh. "Don't play the martyr. You're just as selfish as the rest of us, maybe more so. You don't know what it takes to keep this family afloat, Grace. You've been gone for years, living your cozy little life in Chicago, while I stayed behind and dealt with the mess. And you used Dad's money to bail yourself out of your own mistakes," Grace retorted, her voice rising. "Don't pretend this is about the family. It's about you." Thomas's jaw tightened, and he took a step closer. "If you even think about bringing those documents out tomorrow, I'll drag you into court for slander so fast your head will spin. Is that what you want, Grace? To tear this family apart?" Grace stared at him, her heart pounding. She knew his threats weren't empty. Thomas had the resources and connections to make good on them, but she also knew she couldn't back down. Not this time. "This family deserves the truth," she said firmly, rising to her feet, "and I won't let you bully me into silence." Thomas's eyes flickered with something. Was it fear? Anger? Before he turned and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The next morning, the tension in the house was palpable. Family members milled about the living room, murmuring quietly as they waited for the lawyer to arrive. Grace stood near the window, clutching the folder tightly as she watched the driveway for any sign of Eleanor and the others. Margaret approached her, giving her a reassuring nod. "You're doing the right thing," Margaret said softly. "No matter what happens, remember that." Grace took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of courage she had left. The sound of the front door opening drew everyone's attention as Eleanor entered, carrying a briefcase. She greeted the group politely before motioning for everyone to take their seats. As Grace took her place near the front, she felt the weight of every gaze in the room land on her. Thomas sat across the room, his expression stony and unyielding. The lawyer cleared his throat, signaling the beginning of the proceedings. And so it began. The air in the Carter family's living room was heavy with anticipation. The towering oak beams of the old house loomed overhead, bearing silent witness to what was about to unfold. Every seat in the room was occupied, with a few cousins standing in the corners, whispering amongst themselves. Grace sat in the corner of the long, faded leather couch, her hands gripping the edge of a manila folder so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Across the room, Thomas leaned against the mantel of the stone fireplace, exuding an aura of confidence that made Grace's stomach churn. The family lawyer, Mr. Jameson, an elderly gentleman with a calm demeanor, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Thank you all for gathering today to honor the wishes of your late father, Mr. Henry Carter," he began. His voice was steady, but the undercurrent of tension in the room was unmistakable. "Today, I will read the contents of Mr. Carter's will and testament, outlining his intentions for the future of this family's estate." As Mr. Jameson read through the formalities, outlining small allocations for various family members, Grace's heart pounded. She knew what was coming, or at least she thought she did. This was the moment her father's wishes would finally come to light, a chance to protect the land he cherished so deeply. But before the lawyer could announce the key section of the will, Thomas interrupted. He stepped forward, raising a hand as if he were commanding a boardroom rather than addressing his grieving family. "Let's cut to the chase," he said, his voice sharp and filled with bravado. "Whatever the will says doesn't matter. The reality is this family has no choice but to sell the property. The debt left behind makes it impossible to keep the farm. We need to stop pretending we have other options." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room. Grace shot up from her seat, her voice trembling with both anger and determination. "That's not true, Thomas," she said, holding up her folder. "And you know it." Thomas turned to her, his face hardening. "Oh, here we go. Grace, the dreamer clinging to fairy tales. Do you really think you can save this place with ideals and sentimentality?" Grace stepped forward, opening the folder and holding out the documents inside. "This isn't sentimentality, these are facts. The debt you're talking about isn't tied to the farm. It's tied to you, Thomas. This is your doing, not Dad's." The room fell silent as the family members exchanged uneasy glances. Thomas's jaw clenched. "That's a lie," he hissed, "and you have no proof." Grace handed the documents to Mr. Jameson, who studied them carefully before nodding. "This does appear to show that the loan in question was taken out under Thomas's name," he said, his tone measured, "and not under Mr. Henry Carter's." Thomas's face turned red with fury. "This is absurd," he shouted, turning to the rest of the family. "She's manipulating everyone with half-truths and accusations. She doesn't care about this family, she just wants to play the hero." Before Grace could respond, Mr. Jameson raised his hand to silence the room. "There's more," he said. "Mr. Carter left explicit instructions for today, including a message he recorded shortly before his death. With your permission, I'd like to play it now." The room froze. Grace's heart felt like it might stop altogether. Thomas's confidence faltered as Mr. Jameson pulled out a small recorder and pressed play. Henry Carter's voice filled the room, rich and steady, though tinged with sadness. "To my family," he began. "I hope this message finds you in good health and stronger unity than I witnessed in my final days. I love each of you, but I cannot pretend I don't have concerns about the future of this farm. Thomas, my son, I had high hopes for you, but your choices have jeopardized what generations of Carters built with their sweat and sacrifice. I cannot entrust this land to you." There was an audible gasp from the crowd. Grace's hand covered her mouth as her father's voice continued. "Grace," Henry said, his tone softening, "you've always understood what this land truly means, not just to our family, but to this community. That's why I'm leaving the farm and its resources in your care. Use them wisely and protect them fiercely." The recording ended, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. Thomas's face twisted with rage. "This isn't over," he spat. "I'll fight this. I'll take it to court if I have to. There's no way I'm letting her take everything." Grace met his glare with quiet resolve. "This isn't about taking anything, Thomas," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "It's about honoring Dad's wishes and protecting what he believed in. If that means going to court, so be it." The family began murmuring again, their loyalties and doubts shifting in the wake of the recording. Grace felt the weight of their scrutiny but stood her ground. As Mr. Jameson began wrapping up the reading, Thomas stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Grace turned to see Aunt Margaret giving her an encouraging nod, but the sense of victory was fleeting. She knew this battle was far from over. Thomas's threats loomed heavy in the air, and the family's divisions felt deeper than ever. As she walked out of the room, Grace caught her reflection in a nearby mirror. Her eyes were tired, but her resolve was unshaken. No matter what came next, she would fight for the legacy her father had entrusted to her. The tension in the Carter family hadn't subsided after the reading of the will. If anything, it simmered beneath the surface, waiting for another spark to ignite it. Determined to address the growing divide, Grace invited everyone to gather in the spacious living room of the old farmhouse. It was the heart of the home, where her father used to tell stories by the fireplace during winter nights. The warmth of those memories gave her strength as she stood before the skeptical faces of her family. Her voice was steady, but tinged with emotion. "I've asked you here because we need to talk, really talk, about what this place means to us, to our family, to this community." The words hung in the air as she looked around the room, searching for even a glimmer of understanding. Aunt Margaret sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze encouraging but cautious. Across the room, Thomas leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed and his expression guarded. The other family members filled the space between them, their faces a mix of uncertainty, fatigue, and faint curiosity. Grace took a deep breath. "Dad didn't just leave us a farm, he left us a vision. He wanted this land to become something bigger than ourselves, a sanctuary for future generations, a place where nature could thrive. I know it's not the easy choice, but it's the right one." Her words were met with murmurs of dissent. One cousin muttered about financial practicality, while another uncle shook his head in disbelief. It was Thomas, of course, who voiced the sharpest opposition. "And who's going to make that happen, Grace?" he scoffed, leaning forward with a smirk. "You? The same Grace who dropped out of college because she couldn't handle the pressure? The Grace who's bounced from one failed project to another?" The room fell silent, the air heavy with the weight of his words. Grace felt the familiar sting of shame creeping in, but she straightened her spine and met his gaze. "You're right, Thomas," she said, her voice unwavering. "I've made mistakes, I've failed, but those failures taught me resilience. They taught me how to fight for what matters. And this farm, this dream, is worth fighting for." For a moment, Thomas seemed taken aback by her candor, but he quickly recovered, his expression hardening. "Dreams don't pay the bills, Grace. You're chasing some fantasy while the rest of us are dealing with reality." Before Grace could respond, Aunt Margaret stood up, her movements slow but deliberate. All eyes turned to her as she reached into her bag and pulled out a small, framed photograph. She placed it on the coffee table in front of her, the picture facing the room. It was an old photo of Grace as a little girl, sitting on her father's lap in the very living room where they now stood. Both of them were laughing, their faces radiating joy and closeness. "Henry believed in Grace," Margaret said softly, her voice quivering but firm. "He saw something in her that maybe some of you don't see now. Yes, she stumbled, but she's always gotten back up, and that's exactly the kind of strength it takes to carry out his vision." The room was silent as Margaret continued. "Do you remember what Henry used to say? The land gives and we give back. That's what he wanted, for this land to give something greater to the world. And Grace is the only one willing to honor that." For the first time that evening, Grace saw some of the hardened expressions in the room begin to soften. A cousin who had been quiet the entire time gave a small nod, while an uncle muttered something about needing to think things over. Thomas, however, was unmoved. He shot out of his chair, his face red with anger. "This is absurd. You're all letting yourselves get swept up in sentimental nonsense. I'll be damned if I let Grace of all people dictate what happens to this farm." He stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the house, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Grace let out a shaky breath, her gaze dropping to the photo Margaret had placed on the table. Her father's smile seemed to reassure her, reminding her why she was doing this. "Thank you," she whispered to Margaret, her voice thick with emotion. Margaret gave her a small, knowing smile. "Your father believed in you, Grace. It's time for the rest of us to do the same." As the family members began to leave the room, some lingering to exchange hushed words, Grace felt a faint glimmer of hope. Margaret's support, combined with the subtle shifts in others' attitudes, was a small victory. But she knew the fight was far from over. Thomas's threats weren't idle, and the legal battle he had promised loomed on the horizon. She turned to the window, gazing out at the sprawling fields bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. The land seemed to hum with quiet resilience, a reflection of the fight still burning within her. The battle wasn't just for the farm, it was for everything her father had believed in, and for the person she was becoming, and for that, she was willing to face whatever came next. The courtroom was silent as the gavel struck, signaling the start of what would become the most consequential battle in the Carter family's history. Grace sat at the plaintiff's table, her fingers tightly gripping the edges of a stack of documents. Beside her, Eleanor Jacobs adjusted her glasses, her composed demeanor a stark contrast to the storm of emotions churning in Grace's chest. Across the room, Thomas sat with his attorney, radiating smug confidence, as though the outcome had already been decided in his favor. "Your Honor," Thomas's attorney began, rising with an air of self-assurance, "we will prove today that the late Mr. Henry Carter's final will was influenced, if not outright manipulated, by undue pressure from Miss Grace Carter and her associates." Grace's heart clenched at the accusation, but she straightened her shoulders. Eleanor leaned over, her voice low but firm. "Stay calm. Truth wins in the end." The proceedings unfolded with painstaking precision. Thomas wasted no time launching his attack, painting Grace as a reckless dreamer with no grasp of financial realities. "My sister has lived away from this family for years," Thomas declared, his voice booming through the courtroom. "She abandoned our father when he needed her most, only to return now and claim ownership of a legacy she had no part in preserving." Grace bristled but held her tongue. When it was her turn, she rose slowly, carrying with her the weight of her father's hopes and dreams. Her voice was steady, though tinged with emotion. "I may have been away," she admitted, her gaze sweeping the courtroom, "but I never stopped loving this family or the home we shared. My father wanted this land to mean something, not just to us, but to the community he cherished." Thomas interrupted with a scoff. "Spare us the sentimental nonsense, Grace. This is about reality, not fairy tales." Eleanor stood then, holding up a series of documents. "Your Honor, the defense would like to submit evidence that disproves Mr. Thomas Carter's claims about the family's financial situation." She handed the papers to the clerk, who passed them to the judge. The courtroom buzzed as the documents revealed a shocking twist. Thomas had borrowed against the family's assets, not Henry. The revelation landed like a thunderclap, silencing even Thomas's most ardent supporters in the room. "That's not true!" Thomas burst out, his face red with fury. "She's lying!" Grace remained composed, though her pulse raced. "I didn't create this evidence, Thomas, you did." Just as the room seemed ready to explode with tension, Eleanor called for their star witness, Robert Hales. All heads turned as the unassuming man entered the courtroom, clutching a briefcase. Taking the stand, Robert recounted the financial dealings he had overseen. His testimony was damning. "Mr. Carter," Robert said, nodding toward Thomas, "misrepresented the purpose of his loan, using family assets as collateral without disclosing his intentions to anyone else." Thomas's attorney objected, but the judge allowed Robert to continue. With every word, Thomas's carefully constructed facade crumbled. When the judge finally delivered the ruling, Grace's knees nearly buckled from relief. "The court finds no merit in the plaintiff's claims," the judge announced. "Furthermore, we will refer the matter to the district attorney's office to investigate allegations of fraud." Thomas's face twisted with rage as he stormed out of the courtroom, ignoring the disapproving stares of family members who had once stood by him. Grace, on the other hand, stood tall. She turned to face her family, her voice calm but resolute. "This isn't just about a court ruling. It's about honoring the values our father lived by. I intend to transform this land into the sanctuary he dreamed of, and if any of you want to be a part of that, there's a place for you." Her words hung in the air, and for the first time in days, she saw glimmers of understanding in some of their eyes. Aunt Margaret nodded, her expression one of quiet pride. Later that afternoon, Grace returned to the farm. She walked into the open fields, the golden light of dusk washing over the land. The familiar scent of wildflowers and fresh earth filled her lungs as she closed her eyes and felt the gentle breeze against her skin. In her mind's eye, she saw her father standing by the old oak tree, his hands resting on his hips, a proud smile lighting up his face. "I did it, Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. "I kept my promise." The wind seemed to carry his approval, wrapping her in a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. The golden hues of early autumn bathed the Carter family farm in a soft glow. It had been a month since the intense courtroom battle, and the transformation of the land was well underway. Now bearing a wooden sign reading, "Henry's Legacy, a community conservation center," the farm had become a haven for both nature and neighbors. Children's laughter echoed through the fields as they explored the newly restored trails, while volunteers planted trees along the creek. Farmers and artists set up stands, sharing their crafts and produce, and a group of school children gathered around a guide explaining the importance of preserving the ecosystem. Grace stood silently by the edge of the old barn, her arms crossed loosely as she took in the bustling scene before her. The same barn where she once ran to hide her tears now brimmed with life and laughter. A bittersweet wave swept over her as she remembered her father's vision for this land. He had always believed in nurturing both the soil and the people who walked on it. She let out a long breath, the crisp air filling her lungs. The journey to this moment hadn't been easy. She had been doubted, betrayed, and tested at every turn. But standing here now, she felt an undeniable sense of fulfillment. Every ache, every fight had been worth it. The peace of the day was briefly interrupted when Thomas arrived at the edge of the property. Grace turned, her expression immediately tightening as her brother hesitated by the main gate. His once confident stride was now burdened with weariness, and the fine suits he used to wear were replaced by a plain jacket and jeans. Thomas approached slowly, stopping a few feet from Grace. For a long moment, they said nothing. It was Thomas who broke the silence. "I know I have no right to be here," he began, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it, "but I needed to see it for myself. What you've done, it's beautiful." Grace's jaw tightened, but she stayed silent, waiting. "I was wrong," Thomas admitted, his gaze fixed on the ground. "About the farm, about you, about everything. I let greed blind me. I don't expect you to forgive me, Grace, but I had to say it. I'm sorry." Grace's heart ached as she heard the words she never thought her brother would say. She searched his face, looking for any sign of manipulation or pretense, but all she saw was genuine regret. "Thomas," she began, her tone steady, "I can't erase the damage you've done, not just to me, but to the family and to Dad's memory. But if you truly want to make amends, start by fixing your own life. Prove that you can be better. Do it for yourself, not for me." Thomas nodded, his shoulders sagging under the weight of her words. Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Grace with a mix of relief and sadness. Later that evening, the family gathered in the farmhouse kitchen for a modest ceremony honoring Henry Carter. Aunt Margaret, her warmth filling the room, shared stories of Henry's passion for the farm and his belief in Grace. "He saw in her what he always hoped to see in all of us," Margaret said, raising her glass. "Strength, resilience, and the courage to do what's right." One by one, family members stood to share their memories, their voices carrying both laughter and tears. Even those who had doubted Grace before now expressed their gratitude for her unwavering dedication. The dinner that followed was simple, homemade pies and casseroles spread across the old oak table. But it was filled with something the family hadn't felt in years: unity. As the evening wound down, Grace slipped outside, seeking a quiet moment under the stars. She felt the presence of her father as she looked up at the night sky. "I hope I made you proud, Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustling of the trees. The next morning, Grace found herself alone in the barn. Dust motes floated in the sunlight, streaming through the wooden slats, and the familiar scent of hay brought back memories of a simpler time. She picked up an old photograph of her and her father, smiling broadly as they held a basket of fresh peaches. Tucked behind the frame was a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. It was a note in Henry's handwriting. "Grace, whatever challenges life throws your way, remember, you are stronger than you think, and you are never alone. You are and always will be my greatest legacy. Love, Dad. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched the note to her chest. In that moment, she felt whole, no longer defined by loss or conflict, but by love and purpose. Eleanor joined her later that afternoon, carrying 2 steaming mugs of tea. They sat together on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "You've done something remarkable here, Grace," Eleanor said, her voice filled with admiration. "But Henry would want you to remember, life isn't just about carrying the weight of the world. You deserve happiness too." Before Grace could respond, a truck pulled up to the farm. A young man stepped out, holding a portfolio under his arm. "Excuse me," he called out, approaching the porch. "Are you Grace Carter? I'm Alex Hayes, the architect from the town council. I'm here to discuss plans for the community exhibit." Grace stood to greet him, her smile soft but genuine. "Yes, that's me. Welcome to Henry's legacy." As they shook hands, there was a flicker of something, curiosity, perhaps even possibility. She turned back toward Eleanor, who gave her a knowing smile. For the first time in what felt like forever, Grace allowed herself to consider a future beyond responsibility, a future filled with hope and new beginnings. As the golden sunlight bathed the Carter family farm, Grace's journey came full circle, leaving behind a powerful reminder. True legacies aren't measured by wealth or status, but by the values we choose to protect and the people we inspire. In fighting for her father's dream, Grace found her own strength, proving that even when the odds are stacked against us, resilience and purpose can turn even the hardest battles into transformative victories. What would you fight for if it meant protecting something that truly mattered to you? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your stories and perspectives. And if you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Join us for more stories of courage, resilience, and hope. Until next time, let's keep celebrating the legacies that shape us all.